The key turned in the lock, and Mara Whitfield heard laughter coming from inside her own home. Not her laughter. A woman's laughter. Light and easy. Drifting from the kitchen where she had cooked dinner for Daniel Cross every night for 3 years. She stood frozen on the porch for a moment, her hand still on the door, telling herself it was nothing, maybe a coworker, maybe a friend, anything but what her gut already knew. She pushed the door open anyway. Daniel was standing by the counter with a glass of wine in his hand, and beside him stood a woman Mara had never seen before, wearing one of Mara's own kitchen towels tied around her waist like an apron, like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there. The woman looked up first, startled, but Daniel did not look startled at all. He looked almost relieved, like he had been waiting for this moment to finally happen. "Mara," he said, setting the glass down carefully. "We need to talk." She did not move from the doorway. Her coat was still half off her shoulder, her keys still in her hand. "Who is she, Daniel?" "This is Priya," he said, as if that answered anything. "She's been staying here for a few days." A few days. The words hit Mara like a slap, sharper than if he had shouted them. A few days meant this was not new. A few days meant while she had been at work, closing deals, coming home tired and hopeful, this woman had been folding towels in her kitchen and sleeping somewhere in the house Mara paid half the rent for. "Staying here," Mara repeated slowly, "in our apartment. While I was working." Daniel had the decency to look away for half a second, before his composure returned, cold and practiced, like he had rehearsed this. "I was going to tell you. I just didn't know how." "You didn't know how to tell me you were living with another woman?" "It's not like that," he said, though his tone made it clear it was exactly like that. "Mara, I think we both know this hasn't been working for a long time." She wanted to laugh. Except nothing about this felt funny. 3 years. A ring she had picked out with him on a rainy Saturday, sitting in a drawer upstairs because he said he wanted to save the real proposal for something special. A wedding they had been planning, guest lists half finished, a venue deposit already paid. All of it sitting quietly in the background of her life, while he built a new one in the same house. Priya shifted uncomfortably, pulling the towel off her waist like she suddenly remembered whose kitchen this was. "I should go," she murmured, though she did not actually move. "No," Daniel said, his hand landing on her arm, gentle, familiar. The kind of gentle that only comes from practice. "You don't have to go anywhere." That was when Mara understood completely. This was not a mistake she had walked in on. This was a decision that had already been made, and she was the only person in the room who had not been told about it. "So what happens to me?" Mara asked, and hated how small her voice sounded. Daniel exhaled like she was the one being difficult. "I think it's best if you find somewhere else to stay for a while, just until we figure things out." "Figure things out," she repeated. "You mean until you and Priya figure out how much of my life you're keeping?" "Don't make this ugly, Mara." She almost laughed at that too. He had brought another woman into her home, let her wear her towels, sleep in her bed, and he was asking her not to make it ugly. As if the ugliness had not already been done the moment he chose silence over honesty. She did not scream. She did not throw anything, though later she would wonder why not, why some deep instinct in her simply shut down instead of exploding. She walked past both of them into the bedroom, pulled a suitcase from the closet, and began throwing in whatever her hands landed on first. Clothes, a phone charger, the small wooden box where she kept her mother's earrings, a sweater that still smelled like a version of her life that no longer existed. Daniel appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her pack like he was supervising an inconvenience, rather than witnessing the end of something. "You're being dramatic. You could just take the guest room for a few days." "There is no guest room, Daniel. There's just a room where you're keeping her instead of me." He did not answer that, because there was no answer that would not confirm what she already knew. She zipped the suitcase, grabbed her coat again, and walked past him, without looking at Priya, without looking at the kitchen, where her mother's old recipes sat taped inside a cabinet door, without looking at any of the small pieces of a life she had built with her own hands. She would not give this house the satisfaction of her tears. Not yet. Not here. The night air outside was sharp and clean, almost cruel in how ordinary it felt, as if the world had not just ended for her the way it had. She sat in her car in the driveway for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the front door of the house she was no longer welcome in. Through the window she could see Daniel's silhouette moving comfortably through the kitchen, refilling his wine glass, already settling back into the evening, as though nothing had happened, as though she had never existed there at all. She drove without a destination, taking turns without thinking, following streetlights instead of streets. Her phone buzzed twice with messages from her sister asking if she wanted to get dinner that weekend, cheerful little notifications from a life that did not yet know it had been rearranged. She did not answer. She did not know what she would even say. Hey, guess what? The man I was supposed to marry replaced me while I was at work, and I found out because I walked in on his laughter. At some point, the city lights thinned into darker roads, trees crowding closer on either side, the kind of stretch where phone signal dropped and radio stations dissolved into static. She should have turned back. Some quiet, sensible part of her knew that. But turning back meant facing an empty apartment that was not empty at all. A life that had already moved on without her permission, and she was not ready for that yet. So she kept driving, one hand loose on the wheel, tears finally slipping free now that there was no one left to perform strength for. The road narrowed further, curving into hills she did not recognize, the headlights catching fog that rolled low across the asphalt like something breathing. A sign flickered past too quickly to read fully, something about a town, a distance in miles she did not register. She was running on instinct now, not destination, just the need to put more space between herself and the house where another woman was probably already rearranging the furniture. Her phone screen dimmed, then died completely, the battery drained from the day's stress and forgotten charging. She glanced at the dashboard clock instead, almost midnight. She had been driving for hours without realizing it, her mind replaying the scene in the kitchen on a loop she could not turn off. Priya's hand on the counter, Daniel's voice, calm as if he were discussing weather, instead of ending an engagement. The towel that used to be hers. A deer darted across the road without warning, and Mara jerked the wheel hard, tires screeching against wet asphalt, the car fishtailing before she managed to bring it under control, heart slamming against her ribs. She pulled over onto the narrow shoulder, hands shaking too badly to keep driving safely, and sat there in the dark for a long moment just breathing, trying to convince her body that she was not actually going to fall apart on the side of an unfamiliar road at midnight. When she finally looked up, she noticed the fog had thickened considerably, curling around the edges of her headlights in slow, deliberate waves, almost unnatural in how it moved. The trees on either side of the road stood taller here, older, their branches knitting together overhead, until the sky nearly disappeared. There was no sound at all, not even crickets, which struck her as strange even in her exhausted, grief-soaked state. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. She checked her dead phone uselessly out of habit, then looked at the fuel gauge instead. Just under a quarter tank. Not dangerous yet, but not comfortable either, especially not on a road she did not recognize, heading toward a town she had never heard of, in the middle of the night, with a suitcase full of a life she was no longer sure she wanted back. Somewhere in the distance, faint and low, she thought she heard something that sounded almost like a howl, long and mournful, rising and falling with the wind. She told herself it was a dog, some farm dog, restless in the night. She told herself that twice, before she believed it enough to put the car back into gear and keep driving, slower now, more careful, watching the edges of the headlights for movement. A few miles further, the fog broke just enough to reveal a cluster of small lights ahead, warm and yellow against the darkness, the unmistakable shape of a town settling into the base of the hills. A weathered wooden sign came into view as she approached, the paint faded but still legible in her headlights. Welcome to Hollow Pine. Population modest, the kind of number that suggested everyone likely knew everyone else, the kind of place that did not usually see strangers arrive after midnight with a packed suitcase and swollen eyes. She slowed the car as she entered the town, taking in the quiet main street, shuttered shops with hand-painted signs, a single gas station with its lights still on despite the late hour. Relief loosened something tight in her chest. At least there was a place to stop, a place to breathe, even if only for a night. She had no plan beyond that. No plan beyond simply not being in that house anymore, not being the woman standing in a doorway while her whole future rearranged itself without her. She pulled into the gas station, cutting the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, staring at her own reflection faintly visible in the dark windshield. Her makeup was smudged from crying somewhere along the drive, though she could not remember exactly when. Her hair had come loose from its clip. She looked, she thought distantly, like a woman who had lost something enormous and was only now beginning to understand the size of it. Somewhere behind the gas station, past the tree line that bordered the edge of town, that same low howl rose again into the night, closer this time, and something in Mara's chest tightened with an instinct she could not name. Not quite fear, something stranger than fear, something that felt, absurdly, like being noticed. She stepped out of the car into the cold night air, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders, and walked toward the gas station's glowing entrance, unaware that somewhere beyond the trees, something had already caught her scent on the wind, and had gone very, very still. The bell above the gas station door jingled as Mara stepped inside, and the man behind the counter looked up with the mild surprise of someone who did not often see new faces this late. He was older, maybe 60, with a thick gray beard and reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead. A small radio behind him played static-laced music, barely audible. "Rough night?" he asked, not unkindly, taking in her smudged makeup and the suitcase she had somehow carried in without noticing. "You could say that." Mara tried for a smile that did not quite land. "Is there anywhere in town I could stay tonight? A motel? An inn? Anything?" "Doyle's place, up the road," he said, pointing vaguely north. "Only inn we've got, but Mrs. Doyle keeps a room ready most nights. Tell her Walt sent you. She'll take care of you." "Thank you." Mara hesitated, glancing toward the dark windows, toward the trees she could still feel pressing at the edges of the town even from inside. "I thought I heard something back there, on the road, like a howl." Walt's expression shifted, just slightly, something careful settling behind his eyes. "Probably just the wind through the pines. Does strange things to sound out here." He said it too quickly, too practiced, the way people say things they want to be true, rather than things they know to be true. "Right," Mara said, though she did not entirely believe him. "Well, thank you for the directions. One more thing," Walt added as she turned toward the door. "Once you're settled at Doyle's, best to stay inside after dark. Not because of anything dangerous exactly. Just town customs. Folks around here keep to themselves once night falls." Mara nodded, too tired to ask what that meant, and stepped back out into the cold. The drive to Doyle's Inn took only a few minutes, past darkened storefronts and a small stone church, until she reached a two-story building with warm light spilling from its windows, and a hand-carved sign swinging gently above the door. Mrs. Doyle turned out to be a stout, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, who answered the door in a robe with her hair still pinned up, though she did not seem particularly bothered by the late hour. She looked Mara over once, the way people size up a stray animal deciding whether it needs feeding, and stepped back to let her inside without a single question about why a stranger had arrived at her door past midnight with tear-stained cheeks. "Walt call ahead?" she asked, leading Mara up a narrow staircase. "No, he just gave me directions. Didn't need to call. I could see it on you from the porch light. Man trouble." Mrs. Doyle said it without judgment, simply a fact, stated the way one might comment on the weather. "Rooms at the end of the hall. Bathrooms shared, but you're the only guest tonight, so it's yours alone." The room was small but clean, a quilt-covered bed pushed against one wall, a window overlooking the dark tree line at the edge of town. Mara set her suitcase down and sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the events of the night finally catching up to her all at once. She should call her sister. She should figure out what came next. Instead, she simply sat there, staring at nothing, until exhaustion pulled her down into the pillows without her even meaning to sleep. She woke to gray morning light and the smell of coffee drifting up through the floorboards. For one disoriented moment she forgot where she was, forgot why the ceiling above her was unfamiliar, and then the memory of the previous night crashed back all at once. Daniel's calm voice, Priya's hand pulling free of the towel, the howl in the dark. Downstairs, Mrs. Doyle had laid out a simple breakfast, and Mara ate mechanically, grateful for something to occupy her hands and mouth besides thinking. A few other townspeople drifted through the small dining room, offering polite nods, though Mara noticed how their conversations dropped to murmurs whenever she was within earshot, how their eyes flicked toward the windows more than seemed necessary for an ordinary morning. "You're welcome to stay a few days," Mrs. Doyle said, refilling Mara's coffee without being asked. "Doesn't look like you've got anywhere pressing to be." "I don't," Mara admitted, and saying it out loud made it feel more real, more permanent. No job to rush back to that couldn't wait. No home to return to that still felt like hers. I might take you up on that. Good. Town could use a fresh face, even a tired one. Mrs. Doyle glanced toward the window, toward the tree line visible in the distance, and something crossed her expression too quickly for Mara to name. Just remember what Walt likely told you. Stay close to town proper once the sun starts going down, especially near the tree line. Because of the wolves? Mara guessed, thinking of the howl. Mrs. Doyle's hand paused over the coffee pot for just a moment. Something like that. Mara spent the day wandering Hollow Pine's small main street, more to keep her mind occupied than out of any real curiosity, though the town did have a strange, quiet charm to it. A bakery with bread cooling in the window. A general store that seemed to sell everything from canned goods to fishing tackle. A little library with peeling paint on its door. Everywhere she went, people were friendly enough, but there was an undercurrent she could not quite place. A watchfulness. A habit of glancing toward the forest that bordered the entire town like a living wall. She asked the bakery owner, a soft-spoken woman named Ines, about the howling she had heard the night before, and Ines's easy smile flickered for just a moment before recovering. You get used to it, Ines said, wrapping a loaf of bread for a customer with practiced hands. The woods here are old, lots of wildlife. Best not to go wandering in after dark, that's all. Is that why everyone seems so careful about the tree line? Ines glanced toward the window, toward the dark green line visible past the rooftops, and lowered her voice slightly. There are stories. About someone who watches over the woods, keeps the town safe, mostly, as long as folks respect the boundary. People call him the Alpha, though nobody talks about him much outside their own kitchens. The Alpha, Mara repeated, an odd chill moving through her despite the warmth of the bakery. Just old stories, Ines said quickly, forcing a smile back onto her face. Small towns love their legends. Don't let it worry you. But it did worry her, in a strange, unplaceable way, though not with fear exactly. More like a splinter, lodged somewhere in her mind, a curiosity she could not quite shake. She spent the rest of the afternoon wandering closer to the edge of town than she probably should have, drawn by something she could not name, watching the tree line as the light began to change, gold turning to amber, amber turning to the deep blue of early evening. She told herself she would turn back before dark. She told herself several times, in fact, each time finding one more reason to linger a little longer, one more bench to sit on, one more path to follow just a little further. The forest here was beautiful, in a way that felt almost deliberate. Ancient trees rising in perfect unnatural symmetry. Moss thick and green even this late in the season. The air carrying a scent of pine, and something else beneath it. Something wild and clean, that made her chest ache in a way she did not understand. By the time she realized how far the light had faded, the sun had already dipped fully behind the hills, and the temperature had dropped sharply, her breath visible now in soft white clouds. She turned to head back toward the inn, annoyed with herself for losing track of time so completely, and that was when she heard it again. Not the distant howl from the night before, something closer, something that sounded, unmistakably, like breathing. She froze at the edge of the path, every instinct in her body, suddenly, sharply alert. The forest around her had gone utterly silent, the way it had the night before on the road, as if every living thing within it had gone still at once, waiting. She turned slowly, scanning the tree line, and saw nothing at first, only shadows deepening between the trunks. Then, between two massive pines perhaps 30 feet away, something moved. Not an animal's careless shuffle through underbrush, but something deliberate, something controlled, something with the kind of stillness that came only from absolute confidence. A shape resolved itself slowly from the darkness, tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakably human, in form, and yet carrying itself with something distinctly not human about it. Mara's breath caught in her throat. He did not move closer. He simply stood there, at the very edge of the tree line, watching her with an intensity that made her feel, absurdly, as though every other person she had ever met had only been looking at her, while this stranger was actually seeing her. His eyes, even from this distance, seemed to catch what little light remained, in a way that felt unnatural, a faint glint of something gold beneath the darkness. "I'm sorry," Mara heard herself say, voice unsteady, taking a careful step backward. I didn't mean to wander this close. I was just leaving. He did not answer. He did not need to. Something in the way he held himself communicated more than words could have. A warning and an invitation tangled together in the same breath. Mara's heart pounded, not entirely from fear, though fear was certainly part of it. There was something else threaded through the sensation, something warmer and far more dangerous. A pull she felt in her chest that made absolutely no sense, given she had known this stranger for less than a minute and had not even seen his face clearly. A twig snapped somewhere behind her, and she flinched, glancing away only for a second. When she looked back toward the tree line, he was gone, as though he had never been there at all, only the faint impression that the forest had been watching her the entire time, and had finally, deliberately, let itself be seen. She walked back to Doyle's Inn faster than she meant to, her pulse still racing, glancing over her shoulder more than once, though she saw nothing following her through the darkening streets. By the time she reached the warm, lit doorway of the inn, her hands were shaking, though whether from cold or something else entirely, she could not honestly say. Mrs. Doyle took one look at her face when she stepped inside, and set down the mug she had been holding. "You went near the tree line, didn't you?" It was not really a question. Mara nodded slowly, still catching her breath. "There was someone there, watching me." Mrs. Doyle's expression grew serious, in a way Mara had not seen from her yet, the easy warmth replaced by something more careful, more weighted. "Did he speak to you? Touch you?" "No. He just watched." Something in Mrs. Doyle's shoulders eased slightly, though not entirely. "Then you're lucky. Sit down. I'll make you something warm, and I'll tell you what you need to know about this town, since it seems you're not the type to simply take a warning and leave well enough alone." Mara sat, still trembling faintly, unable to shake the image of those gold-flecked eyes watching her from the darkness, unable to shake the strange, impossible certainty that whatever had been standing at that tree line had not merely noticed her by accident. It had been waiting, and somehow, without knowing anything about this town or its legends, Mara understood, with sudden, bone-deep clarity, that her arrival in Hollow Pine had not been an accident either. Mrs. Doyle set a mug of something hot and spiced in front of Mara, then settled into the chair across from her, with the deliberate slowness of someone about to say something she had said before, though clearly not often. The dining room had emptied out for the night, the other lodgers already retired upstairs, leaving only the two of them and the soft crackle of the fireplace in the corner. "Hollow Pine has been here a long time," Mrs. Doyle began, wrapping both hands around her own mug. "Longer than most towns this size have any business surviving. Part of the reason for that is the forest, and part of the reason is what lives in it." "The Alpha," Mara said quietly. "His name is Cain," Mrs. Doyle said, and something about hearing an actual name attached to the shape she had seen at the tree line sent an unexpected shiver through Mara's chest. "Cain Ashwood. His family has watched over these woods for generations, long before my grandmother's grandmother was born. Some say his kind has always been here, older than the town itself, and the town simply grew up around them because it was safer that way." "His kind," Mara repeated carefully. "You mean he's not entirely human?" Mrs. Doyle did not flinch from the question, though she chose her next words with obvious care. "There are old bloodlines in this world, Mara. Families that carry something ancient in them, something that lets them become more than what most people are. Cain is the last of a very old line, and by all accounts, the strongest one Hollow Pine has seen in generations. People call him a monster, because it's easier to fear a monster than to understand something you don't have words for. And the townspeople just accept that, living beside something like that. He keeps us safe," Mrs. Doyle said simply. "There are worse things in these hills than Cain Ashwood, things that used to come down from the mountains and take livestock, sometimes worse. Since his family settled the tree line generations back, none of that has touched Hollow Pine. We give him his boundary, we respect his territory, and in exchange, this town sleeps peacefully at night. It's an old arrangement, and it's worked for a very long time." Mara turned the mug slowly between her hands, absorbing this, trying to reconcile it with the memory of those gold-flecked eyes watching her from the shadows, patient and still and undeniably intelligent. "Why did he let me see him tonight? You said people who wander too close usually just feel watched, or hear something in the trees. He didn't just watch me from a distance. He came close enough that I could see him clearly. Mrs. Doyle's expression shifted into something Mara could not quite name. Part curiosity, part concern. That's not something I've heard of happening in a long while. Kane doesn't show himself to strangers. Not fully, not like that. What does it mean? I couldn't tell you for certain, Mrs. Doyle admitted. But if I were you, I'd be careful all the same. Whatever drew his attention, it drew it strongly enough to break a habit he's kept for as long as I've been alive. Mara did not sleep well that night, her mind circling endlessly around the image of him standing at the tree line, the strange magnetic pull she had felt even from 30 feet away, the way her chest had ached with something unfamiliar the moment his eyes had found hers. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was simply raw and vulnerable after Daniel, susceptible to any intensity aimed her way because her own heart had been left in pieces on a kitchen floor 2 nights ago. That explanation made sense. It was reasonable. It was also, she suspected somewhere beneath her exhaustion, not entirely true. The next morning brought clear skies and a strange restlessness she could not shake. She helped Mrs. Doyle with small chores around the inn, more to keep her hands busy than out of any real obligation, and by early afternoon, found herself once again drawn toward the edge of town, though this time, she stayed carefully on the paved path that skirted the tree line, rather than wandering into the trees themselves. She told herself she simply wanted fresh air. She told herself the walk had nothing to do with the man she had seen the night before. Neither excuse held up particularly well under scrutiny, but she chose not to examine that too closely. The forest looked different in daylight, less foreboding, sunlight breaking through the canopy and scattered gold patches across the forest floor. Birds called from somewhere deep within the trees, an ordinary peaceful sound that eased some of the tension she had been carrying since the night before. She walked for nearly an hour, following the path as it curved gently along the boundary, before she rounded a bend and found herself face to face with him. He was standing perfectly still, in a small clearing just off the path, close enough now that she could see him clearly for the first time. He was tall, easily a head taller than she was, with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead, and features carved with a kind of severe, unsettling beauty, sharp jaw, high cheekbones, skin that looked like it rarely saw the inside of a building. He wore simple clothes, a dark jacket over a plain shirt, nothing that marked him as anything other than an ordinary man, except for his eyes. Up close, the gold flecks she had noticed the night before were unmistakable, threaded through irises so dark they were nearly black, watching her now with an intensity that made her feel exposed down to her bones. "You came back," he said, his voice low and rough, like it was not used often. "I didn't mean to find you," Mara said, though even as she said it, she suspected that was not entirely true either. "I was just walking. No one walks this close to the boundary without meaning to." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "You should not be here. Then why haven't you told me to leave?" The question seemed to surprise him, a faint crease forming between his brows, as though he had not expected to be challenged. "I don't know," he admitted, and something in his voice suggested this honesty cost him something, that he was not a man accustomed to uncertainty. "I should want you gone. Every instinct I have has told me for 2 nights now to make sure you never come near this tree line again." And yet, Mara echoed softly, unable to look away from him. "I'm Kane," he said finally, as though offering his name was some kind of concession he had not planned on making. "Mara." He repeated her name quietly, almost to himself, like he was testing the weight of it, and something about the way he said it sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, foolish and unearned given they had exchanged perhaps a dozen words total, given she had been someone else's fiancé only 3 days ago. She pushed the thought away, uncomfortable with how quickly her body seemed willing to respond to a stranger's voice when she should still have been drowning in grief over Daniel. "The people in town told me things about you," Mara said, partly to fill the silence, partly because she genuinely wanted to know how much of it was true. "They said you're not entirely human." Kane's jaw tightened slightly, though he did not look away. "What else did they say?" "That your family has protected this town for generations. That you keep worse things away from here." She hesitated. "That you're called the Alpha." "All true," he said simply. No defensiveness in his tone, no attempt to soften the admission. "I am what the old stories call a shifter, though the word means less than people assume." I am the last of my line strong enough to hold this territory, and holding it means keeping this town safe from things far worse than anything they imagine when they whisper about me in their kitchens. And the howling I heard the first night? That was me, he admitted, watching her carefully for her reaction, patrolling the boundary. It's not something I usually let strangers hear so clearly. Sound carries strangely out here when I choose it to. Mara absorbed this slowly, waiting for fear to arrive, waiting for the instinct to run, that seemed like the reasonable response to standing in a forest clearing, with a man who had just calmly admitted to being something other than human. But the fear did not come, not in the way she expected. Instead, there was only that same strange, magnetic pull from the night before, stronger now that she stood close enough to see the faint gold flecks catching the sunlight in his eyes, close enough to feel warmth radiating from him despite the cool forest air. "You're not afraid," Kane observed, something like surprise coloring his voice. "I don't know what I am," Mara admitted honestly. 3 days ago, my entire life fell apart. I drove until I couldn't drive anymore, and ended up here by accident. And now I'm standing in a forest, talking to a man who just told me he's not entirely human, and somehow that's not even close to the strangest part of my week. Something shifted in his expression then, a flicker of understanding, maybe even sympathy, though it looked unfamiliar on features that seemed built more for severity than softness. "Someone hurt you," he said, not quite a question. "Someone I was supposed to marry brought another woman into our home while I was at work," Mara said, the words easier to say now than they had been 3 nights ago, though they still ached in her chest like a fresh bruise. "I found out by walking in on them." Kane's expression darkened, something feral flashing briefly behind his eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared, though Mara noticed it, noticed the way his hands closed briefly into fists at his sides, before deliberately relaxing again. "Any man who would do that to someone does not deserve to keep breathing the same air as her," he said, low and rough, the words carrying a weight that felt oddly protective given they had known each other for less than 10 minutes total. "That's a strange thing to say to a stranger," Mara said, though she found she did not mind hearing it. "I don't know why I said it." Kane looked genuinely troubled by his own reaction, a faint frown creasing his forehead. "I don't say things like that. I don't feel things like that. Not for people I've just met." "Maybe I'm not just a stranger to you," Mara offered quietly, not entirely sure where the words came from, only that they felt true the moment she said them. Kane's eyes met hers again, something intense and unguarded passing between them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the forest around them utterly silent, as though even the birds had paused to witness whatever was happening between two people, who had no reasonable explanation for the pull drawing them together. Mara felt her pulse quicken, felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cool air, felt something in her chest crack open just slightly, not with pain this time, but with something dangerously close to hope. "You should go back to town before dark," Kane said finally, his voice rougher than before, as though he were forcing himself to say something practical, instead of whatever else had been building between them. "It isn't safe for you out here once the sun sets, not because of me, but because of what I keep out." "Will I see you again?" Mara asked, surprising herself with how much she wanted the answer to be yes. Kane hesitated, something conflicted moving behind his gold-flecked eyes, before he finally said, quietly, almost reluctantly, "I don't think I could stay away even if I tried." Mara walked back toward Doyle's Inn that afternoon, with her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear, replaying his words over and over, the low, rough sound of his voice, the intensity in his eyes when he had spoken about Daniel with a kind of protective anger that made no logical sense given how recently they had met. She should have been cautious. She should have remembered that she barely knew this man, that he had openly admitted to being something other than human, that 3 days ago she had been engaged to someone else entirely. Instead, for the first time since walking into that kitchen and hearing another woman's laughter, Mara Whitfield felt something other than grief settling into the empty space in her chest. She felt, impossibly, something that almost resembled being wanted. That evening, as she sat by the window of her small room at Doyle's Inn, watching the tree line darken with the setting sun, she thought she saw a shape moving just at the edge of the trees, tall and still, watching the inn the way he had watched her the night before. She did not feel afraid of it this time. She simply watched back, until the shape finally, slowly, faded into the deepening shadows of the forest, and she was left wondering what exactly she had wandered into, and whether she wanted, even a little, to be found by it again. Over the following days, Mara found herself walking the boundary path more often than she could reasonably justify, and each time, without fail, Cain was there waiting, as though some invisible thread had begun pulling them both toward the same clearing at the same hour. Their conversations grew longer, easier, the careful distance between them shrinking a little more each time, until Mara realized she was no longer counting the days since Daniel's betrayal, but the hours since she had last seen Cain's face. It was on the fifth evening, as gold light slanted low through the pines, that Cain finally told her the part of the truth he had been holding back. "There's something about you I don't fully understand," he admitted, standing closer to her than he had before, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him even in the cooling air. "Shifters like me, we don't simply choose who we're drawn to. There's a pull, older than choice, something our instincts recognize before our minds catch up to it. It's rare. Most of my kind live their whole lives without ever feeling it once." "And you're feeling it now," Mara said quietly, though it was not really a question. "Since the moment you stepped out of your car at that gas station," Cain admitted, something raw and unguarded in his voice. "I felt it before I ever saw your face. I told myself it was a mistake, that a human couldn't possibly be the one thing my instincts have been waiting a lifetime for. I've spent 5 nights trying to convince myself I was wrong, and failing every single time." Mara's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering with something that felt dangerously close to disbelief and hope tangled together. "What does that mean exactly, this pull?" "In the old stories we call it a mark," Cain said, his gold-flecked eyes steady on hers. "When a shifter finds the one person capable of matching them, calming them, completing something instinctual in them that nothing else ever could, the bond marks itself, body and instinct both. It's permanent. It doesn't happen twice, and it doesn't happen to people who aren't meant for it." "You're saying I'm your mark," Mara said slowly, testing the weight of the word. "I'm saying, I've never wanted anything the way I want to protect you," Cain said, his voice low and rough with an intensity that made her pulse race. "And that terrifies me more than anything in these woods ever has, because it means I have something to lose now, for the first time in longer than I can remember." Before Mara could respond, a sharp crack of a branch sounded from somewhere behind them, and Cain's entire posture shifted instantly, protective and alert, stepping slightly in front of her without seeming to think about it at all. A woman emerged from the tree line a moment later, moving with the same unnatural grace Mara had noticed in Cain, her dark eyes narrowing the moment they landed on Mara. "So the rumors are true," the woman said, her voice cool and edged with something dangerously close to contempt. "The great Alpha, finally marked, and by a human, of all things." "Celine," Cain said, his tone flat and warning, "this isn't your concern. Everything that happens on this territory is my concern," Celine said, stepping closer, her gaze raking over Mara with open disdain. "You know what the elders will say about this. A human cannot hold an Alpha's mark. She'll grow old and fragile, while you remain exactly as you are. She'll never understand what you truly are, not fully, not the parts of you that matter most. This isn't a bond, Cain. It's a weakness waiting to be exploited." "That is not your decision to make," Cain said, a low growl threading through his voice that made the hair on Mara's arms rise. "It won't only be my decision," Celine said coldly. "There are others in this territory who will not accept a human standing where a true mate should stand. You've made yourself vulnerable, Cain, and vulnerability in an alpha invites challenge. You know this better than anyone." Mara stood very still, absorbing the threat woven carefully beneath Celine's words, understanding for the first time that whatever was happening between herself and Cain was not simply a private, personal matter. It existed within a larger world, a world with its own rules, its own dangers, and apparently its own enemies who would not welcome her presence gladly. "Leave," Cain said, his voice dropping into something almost unrecognizable, deep and commanding, in a way that made even Celine's confident posture falter slightly. "Now." Celine held his gaze for a long, tense moment, some silent battle of will passing between them, before she finally stepped back, though not without one last glance toward Mara, sharp and calculating. "This isn't finished," she said, before melting back into the tree line as silently as she had appeared. Mara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her hands trembling slightly. Who was that? Celine leads a faction within my territory, who believe the old bloodlines should remain unmixed, Kane said, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. She's dangerous, and she's not wrong that others share her views. I should have expected this reaction the moment I let myself acknowledge the mark. Are we in danger? Mara asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. Kane turned to face her fully, his expression softening slightly despite the tension still evident in his shoulders. I won't let anything happen to you, he said, the vow in his voice unmistakable, ancient and absolute, in a way that sent a shiver down Mara's spine, that had nothing to do with fear. But you deserve to know the truth of what you're stepping into, if you choose to stay. This won't be simple. There will be those who challenge it, who challenge me, who may try to use you against me. Mara thought of the empty apartment she had left behind, the life with Daniel, that had turned out to be built on nothing but convenient silence and quiet betrayal. She thought of the strange, undeniable warmth that had settled into her chest every single time Kane's eyes found hers over the past 5 days. A warmth entirely unlike anything she had felt in 3 years, with a man who had ultimately proven he did not value her at all. I've spent 3 years with someone who never once looked at me the way you just looked at Celine when she threatened me, Mara said quietly. I think I'd rather face something dangerous and real than go back to something safe and empty. Kane studied her for a long moment, something fierce and grateful moving behind his gold-flecked eyes, before he reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, and gently brushed his fingers against her cheek. The contact sent warmth spreading through her entire body, unfamiliar and electric, and Mara found herself leaning into it rather than pulling away. Then I need you to understand something, Kane said softly. Once a mark is acknowledged fully, there's no undoing it. Not for me, and eventually, not for you either. Your instincts will begin to recognize mine the way mine already recognize yours. It changes things, slowly, permanently. I'm not afraid of that, Mara admitted, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. You should be a little afraid, Kane said, the ghost of a smile touching his features for the first time since she had met him, softening the severe lines of his face into something almost boyish. I am. They stood together in the clearing as the last light faded from the sky, and for the first time since walking into that kitchen and hearing another woman's laughter where her own life used to be, Mara Whitfield felt something settle inside her chest that felt less like grief and more like the quiet, dangerous beginning of belonging somewhere entirely new. She did not yet know about Celine's growing faction gathering in the deeper hills, did not yet know how far some of them would go to challenge a bond they considered a weakness. She only knew that for the first time, in longer than she could remember, someone was looking at her like she mattered completely, and she was not ready to let that go, regardless of what dangers waited in the dark beyond the tree line. 2 weeks passed, and Hollow Pine had slowly, quietly, become something like home. Mara had taken a small job helping Enos at the bakery in the mornings, learning the rhythm of the town, the names of its people, the particular way Mrs. Doyle hummed while she cooked. In the evenings, she walked the boundary path and found Kane waiting, their bond deepening with every conversation, every quiet moment shared in the fading light. She had not called Daniel once. She had not needed to. Which was why the sound of a car engine pulling up outside Doyle's Inn on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, followed by a voice she recognized instantly, sent ice through her veins. Mara Whitfield, Daniel's voice carried through the open front door, carefully rehearsed, practiced charm layered over obvious nerves. Please tell me you're actually here. Your sister said this was the last place your phone pinged before it died. Mara stepped out from the kitchen, where she had been helping Mrs. Doyle with dinner preparations, and there he was, standing in the doorway of the inn, looking entirely out of place in his pressed shirt and expensive shoes, a version of a life she had left behind, standing awkwardly in a room that had never known him. What are you doing here, Daniel? Looking for you, he said, stepping further inside, his eyes taking in the modest inn, with poorly disguised confusion, as if he could not quite understand what would draw her to somewhere like this. You disappeared for 2 weeks, Mara. No calls, no messages, nothing. Do you have any idea how worried everyone's been? I left my number with my sister. Mara said flatly. If everyone was so worried, they could have called her. I needed to see you myself. Daniel's expression shifted into something softer, more contrite, the practiced apologetic look he used to give her whenever he had worked late without calling, whenever he had forgotten an anniversary. Mara, I made a mistake. A huge mistake. Priya moved out days after you left. It wasn't what I thought it was, and losing you like that made me realize what I actually had. Mara felt something cold settle in her stomach, not longing, not the ache she might have expected 2 weeks ago, but something closer to disbelief, that he genuinely believed this approach might work. You didn't lose me, Daniel. You threw me away, and now that the replacement didn't work out, you've come to see if the original is still available. That's not fair, Daniel said, though his voice lacked the conviction to make the protest land. I know I hurt you. I know I handled everything terribly. But 3 years, Mara, that has to mean something. It did mean something, Mara said quietly, until you decided it didn't, in front of me, in our own kitchen. Mrs. Doyle appeared in the doorway behind Mara, arms crossed, her expression openly unimpressed with the stranger standing in her front hall. Everything all right in here? Fine, Mara said, though her voice was tighter than she intended. This is Daniel. He was just leaving. I'm not leaving until we actually talk, Daniel said, an edge of familiar stubbornness creeping into his tone, the same tone he used to use whenever he wanted something, and had decided persistence was the most efficient path to getting it. I drove 3 hours to find you, Mara. The least you owe me is a real conversation. I don't owe you anything, Mara said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded, how little his presence actually shook her, compared to how she might have expected 2 weeks ago. But fine. Outside. 5 minutes. They stepped onto the porch together, the late afternoon air cool and sharp, the tree line visible in the distance where Mara knew, with a certainty she could not entirely explain, that Cain was somewhere within it, perhaps already aware that something in his territory had shifted, that a threat unlike Celine had arrived in an entirely different form. I mean it, Mara, Daniel said, softer now that they were alone. I want you to come home. We can plan the wedding again, exactly like before. I'll make it right. You don't understand, Mara said, shaking her head slowly, an odd, quiet clarity settling over her. I don't want it exactly like before. Before, I was someone who came second in my own home, without even realizing it. I don't want that life back, Daniel. I've found something else. Something shifted in Daniel's expression, calculation replacing contrition. Found what exactly? This town? These people? He gestured vaguely at the inn, at Hollow Pine beyond it, his tone edging toward condescension. Mara, be reasonable. You can't actually be building a life somewhere like this. You'd be surprised what I've found here, Mara said, and for the first time since he arrived, she allowed herself a small, private smile, thinking of gold-flecked eyes, and a low, rough voice promising to keep her safe. Daniel's gaze narrowed slightly, something suspicious sharpening his features. Is there someone else? Is that what this is? There's someone, Mara admitted, seeing no reason to hide it. Someone who's never once made me feel like an inconvenience he needed to quietly replace. You've known him for 2 weeks, Daniel said, disbelief coloring his voice. Mara, this is insane. You're going to throw away 3 years for some stranger you met in the middle of nowhere? You threw away 3 years the moment you decided Priya could move in while I was at work, Mara said, her voice steady and clear. I'm just the one finally admitting it's over. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a low growl sounded from the tree line at the edge of the property, deep and unmistakable, carrying a warning that needed no translation. Daniel's head snapped toward the sound, his face paling slightly. What was that? Local wildlife, Mara said calmly, though her heart had begun pounding with a mixture of nerves and something that felt suspiciously like relief. You should probably head back before dark. The roads aren't well marked out here, and it gets easy to lose your way. Mara, be serious. You can't stay in a place like this. Daniel's confidence had cracked slightly, replaced by genuine unease as his eyes scanned the darkening tree line. I've never been more serious about anything, Mara said. Goodbye, Daniel. He stood on the porch for a long moment, clearly torn between pressing the issue further and the growing discomfort of standing so close to a forest that had just made its displeasure unmistakably clear. Finally, muttering something about her having lost her mind, he retreated to his car, casting one last uneasy glance toward the trees, before driving away in a spray of gravel. Mara remained on the porch long after his taillights disappeared, breathing slowly, feeling something settle inside her that had been unsettled since the moment she found Priya in her kitchen. Closure, she realized. That was what this had been. Not the reconciliation Daniel had hoped for, but a door finally, firmly closing on a chapter of her life that no longer belonged to her. She was not surprised when Kane emerged from the tree line a few minutes later, his expression tight with barely restrained tension, his eyes searching her face for any sign of distress. "I heard him," Kane said, his voice rough. "I smelled the fear in the air when he first arrived, and something else beneath it, older, familiar. That was the one who hurt you." "That was Daniel," Mara confirmed. "He wanted me to come back, to pretend the last 3 weeks never happened." "And what did you tell him?" Mara stepped down from the porch and crossed the distance between them, close enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough to see the tension slowly easing from his shoulders as she approached. "I told him goodbye." Kane's hand came up to gently cradle her face, his thumb brushing softly against her cheek, and Mara leaned into the touch without hesitation, without the fear or doubt that would have once made her second-guess something this intense, this soon. "I wanted to tear him apart the moment I caught his scent," Kane admitted quietly, something feral and protective still simmering beneath his controlled exterior. "It took everything I had to stay in these trees and trust you to handle him yourself." "I did handle him," Mara said softly. "I don't need protecting from everything, Kane. Just the things that are actually dangerous." "He's not the dangerous one," Kane said, his expression darkening slightly, and Mara felt a chill move through her at the shift in his tone. "Celine's faction has been growing bolder since the night she found us in the clearing. There have been challenges issued, whispers among the older bloodlines about forcing the issue before the mark fully sets. I didn't want to worry you until I understood the scope of it, but I think that time has passed." "What does that mean exactly? Forcing the issue?" Kane's jaw tightened, his gold-flecked eyes flickering briefly with something dangerously close to alarm, an emotion Mara had not yet seen from him in the weeks she had known him. "It means they may try to remove you from this territory, by whatever means necessary, before the bond becomes permanent enough that severing it would harm me as much as it would harm you. Some of them believe that's still possible. I need you to understand, the danger has become real, Mara, not simply a distant threat lingering at the edges of old traditions." Mara felt a shiver move through her that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air, the weight of Kane's words settling over her slowly. Two enemies now stood between her and the fragile new life she had begun building in Hollow Pine, one from the world she had left behind, and one from the world she had only just begun to understand. But standing there in the fading light, Kane's hand still warm against her cheek, his eyes fierce with a protectiveness that felt nothing like the quiet neglect she had endured for 3 years with Daniel, Mara found she was not tempted to run from either threat. "Then we face it," she said simply, surprising herself with how little her voice shook. "Together." Something fierce and grateful passed across Kane's face, and he pulled her gently against his chest, his arms wrapping around her with a careful strength that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely, completely safe. "Together," he echoed softly, the word carrying the weight of a vow neither of them fully understood yet, though both were beginning to sense just how much it would eventually cost to keep. Overhead, clouds had begun gathering along the ridgeline, dark and heavy, promising a storm before morning, and somewhere deep within the forest, Mara thought she could hear the faint, distant sound of voices raised in argument, carried on the wind from wherever Celine's faction had gathered to decide, once and for all, whether a human woman would be permitted to stand beside their alpha, or whether they intended to make certain she never had the chance. The storm broke just after midnight, thunder rolling low over the hills, rain hammering against the windows of Doyle's Inn hard enough that Mara lay awake listening to it, unable to shake the unease that had settled into her chest since Kane's warning at the tree line. She had barely drifted into a shallow, restless sleep when a sharp knock sounded at her door, urgent and insistent. Mrs. Doyle stood in the hallway when Mara opened it, fully dressed despite the hour, her face drawn tight with worry. "Kane's outside," Says he needs you now. And from the look on his face, I wouldn't waste time asking questions. Mara dressed quickly, pulling on boots and a coat over her nightclothes, and found Kane waiting at the base of the porch steps, rain plastering his dark hair against his forehead, his entire posture rigid with barely contained urgency. They're moving tonight, he said without preamble. Celine has convinced enough of the older bloodlines that the storm gives them cover. They mean to take you from the town before dawn, before the mark has time to fully anchor between us. Take me where? Somewhere I won't be able to follow easily, Kane said grimly. Deep enough into contested territory that retrieving you would mean starting a conflict that could cost lives on both sides, human and shifter alike. Celine believes that once you're gone long enough, the bond will weaken enough that I'll eventually accept its loss rather than risk further bloodshed. Fear spiked sharp and sudden through Mara's chest, though beneath it, something steadier held firm, an anger that surprised her with its intensity. She had already lost one home to someone else's decision made without her consent. She was not prepared to lose this one the same way. Then we don't let them, she said simply. Kane studied her for a moment, something fierce and proud moving behind his eyes despite the danger pressing in around them. I won't let anything happen to you, he said again, the same vow he had made in the clearing weeks ago, though it carried far more weight now that the threat had become immediate and real. But I need you to trust me completely tonight, and I need you to stay close, no matter what you see happen in these woods before morning. Mara nodded, her heart pounding, and followed him into the storm, rain soaking through her coat within minutes as they moved swiftly toward the tree line, Kane's senses clearly tracking something Mara could neither see nor hear. The forest at night, in the middle of a storm, felt like an entirely different world than the peaceful clearing where they had spent so many quiet evenings together, every shadow suddenly holding the possibility of danger. They had not gone far past the boundary when shapes began emerging from the darkness around them, moving with the same unnatural grace Mara had first noticed in Kane, forming a loose, deliberate circle that left no easy path of retreat. Celine stepped forward from among them, rain running down her face, her expression cold and resolute in the flashes of distant lightning. You shouldn't have brought her out here tonight, Kane, Celine said, raising her voice slightly over the storm. It only makes this easier. You will not touch her, Kane said, his voice dropping into that same deep, commanding register Mara had heard once before, though now it carried an edge of genuine violence barely held in check, the forest around them seeming to still despite the raging storm. This isn't about wanting to hurt her, Celine said, though her eyes flicked toward Mara with something that suggested otherwise. It's about protecting what this territory has always been. A human cannot hold an alpha's mark without eventually destroying everything the old bloodlines have built. You know this, Kane, even if you refuse to admit it to yourself. I know that for the first time in longer than I can remember, I feel something worth protecting, Kane said, stepping slightly in front of Mara, his shoulders squared against the circle closing in around them. And I know that anyone who tries to take that from me will regret it. Celine's expression hardened, and she gave a small, sharp nod to the shapes surrounding them. What happened next unfolded almost too quickly for Mara to fully track, a blur of motion, as several of the shifters lunged forward at once, and Kane moved to meet them, with a speed and ferocity that left Mara staring in stunned disbelief, understanding for the first time the true scope of what he actually was. He fought with a controlled, devastating precision, each movement economical and certain, driving back one attacker after another, without ever allowing them to close the distance toward Mara, who had pressed herself instinctively against the trunk of a massive pine, watching the chaos unfold, with her heart hammering against her ribs. Rain lashed sideways in the wind, lightning illuminating brief, sharp glimpses of the confrontation, Kane's movements almost too fast to follow clearly. Celine circled wide during the chaos, attempting to slip past the confrontation toward Mara directly, and for one heart-stopping moment their eyes met across the clearing, Celine's expression unreadable in the darkness. Mara did not run. She thought of Daniel's calm, cowardly silence in that kitchen weeks ago, thought of how she had let fear and heartbreak nearly convince her that she deserved to simply accept whatever life handed her without a fight. She was not that woman anymore. You picked the wrong person to threaten, Mara said, her voice steadier than she felt, as Celine closed the distance between them. You don't belong here, Celine said, something almost desperate threading beneath her cold exterior now. a fear of her own, Mara had not expected to see. You'll destroy him eventually, whether you mean to or not. Humans always do. Maybe, Mara said. Or maybe he's stronger than you're willing to believe, and maybe I am too. Before Celine could respond, Cain appeared between them, with a speed that left Mara momentarily disoriented, his expression a mask of barely restrained fury, as he placed himself directly in Celine's path. "This ends now," he said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to physically press against everyone in the clearing, an unmistakable weight of true dominance that made even Celine's confident stance falter. "You would choose a human over your own bloodline," Celine said, though the challenge in her voice had thinned considerably, uncertainty creeping into features that had been so certain moments before. "I would choose someone who has never once looked at me like I was a burden to manage, or a monster to fear," Cain said. "She sees me clearly, Celine, more clearly than anyone within these woods ever has, and I will not apologize for what that means to me." The remaining shifters, sensing the shift in the confrontation, the absolute certainty in Cain's voice and stance, began to fall back one by one, their earlier aggression fading into something closer to uncertainty. Celine stood alone in the clearing for a long, tense moment, rain streaming down her face, before finally, slowly, she lowered her gaze in unmistakable submission. "The old bloodlines will not simply forget this," she said quietly, though the fight had visibly drained from her voice. "Then they'll have to learn to accept it," Cain said, "the same way I have." Celine held his gaze a moment longer before retreating into the storm without another word, the remaining shifters melting away into the darkness behind her, until Mara and Cain stood alone once more in the rain-soaked clearing, the storm beginning, gradually, to ease around them. Cain turned to her immediately, his hands coming up to frame her face, checking for any sign of harm, with an urgency that made Mara's chest ache with the depth of feeling behind it. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Mara said, and found, to her own surprise, that it was true. That beneath the lingering adrenaline, she felt something steadier than fear settling into place, something that felt almost like triumph. "You came for me." "I will always come for you," Cain said, his voice rough with emotion, rain dripping from his dark hair, as he studied her face, with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Whatever comes next, whatever the old bloodlines decide to do about tonight, that will never change." The following weeks brought a quiet, cautious peace to Hollow Pine. Word of the confrontation spread through the shifter community that bordered the town, and while whispers of dissent lingered among a few of the older bloodlines, no one moved against Cain or Mara again, Celine's defeat having settled the matter more firmly than any words could have. Mrs. Doyle continued fussing over Mara like family. Ines kept a standing invitation open for Mara to help at the bakery whenever she liked, and the town that had once felt so foreign to her slowly, steadily, became something Mara had never quite dared to call home before, in 3 years with Daniel, or in any version of her life that came before Hollow Pine. Daniel did not return again. Mara heard, secondhand through her sister, that Priya had moved back in with him within a month of his failed visit, and that the two of them had already begun arguing about the same quiet neglect that had once driven Mara out of that kitchen entirely. She felt, when she heard the news, not vindication, but simply a distant, quiet relief that his choices no longer had any power to touch the life she had built. On a clear evening some weeks later, Cain led her to the same clearing where they had first truly spoken, the forest calm and peaceful, under a sky scattered with early stars. He turned to her there, something solemn and certain in his gold-flecked eyes, and Mara understood, before he even spoke, that this moment had been building since the night she first stepped out of her car at that small gas station, and felt, without understanding why, that something in these woods had already been waiting for her. "The mark between us has settled fully now," Cain said quietly. "It's permanent, unbreakable by anything short of death itself. I need you to know exactly what that means before we go any further, Mara. This life, this territory, everything I am, it will belong to you as much as it belongs to me, for as long as we both live." "I've never wanted anything the way I want that," Mara said, her voice steady despite the fullness in her chest, the aching, grateful disbelief that after everything, after the humiliation in that kitchen and the long dark drive that followed it, she had found her way to exactly where she was always meant to be. Cain pulled her close then, his forehead resting gently against hers, and Mara closed her eyes, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest around them, feeling, for the first time in her entire life, completely and finally chosen. Not settled for, not tolerated. Chosen, fully and without hesitation, by someone who had looked past every ordinary version of herself and recognized something worth fighting, an entire bloodline to protect. The woman who had once stood frozen in a doorway, listening to another woman's laughter fill a home that no longer wanted her, was gone. In her place stood someone who understood, with absolute certainty, that being unwanted by the wrong person had only ever been the beginning of being found by exactly the right one, and that sometimes the most extraordinary love waited quietly in the last place anyone would think to look for it, deep within the shadows of an ancient forest, guarded by a monster who turned out to be nothing of the kind at all. Spring came early to Hollow Pine that year, the tree lines softening from bare winter branches into pale green buds, almost overnight, and with it came changes Mara could never have imagined the night she first drove into town with a suitcase full of a life she thought she had lost. She had moved out of her small room at Doyle's Inn months ago, into a stone cottage at the edge of Cain's territory that the pack had helped rebuild for her, its windows overlooking the very clearing where everything between them had first taken root. The town had grown used to her presence in a way that still occasionally caught her off guard, shopkeepers greeting her by name, children waving from porches as she walked to the bakery each morning, the quiet, steady rhythm of belonging settling into her bones, in a way 3 years with Daniel had never managed to accomplish. She thought of him rarely now, and when she did, it was with the distant, almost gentle curiosity of remembering someone from a very different chapter of her life, rather than any lingering ache. Celine, surprisingly, had not left the territory as Mara once assumed she might after her defeat in the storm. Instead, she had remained on its edges, quiet and watchful, and slowly, cautiously, something like an uneasy respect had begun forming between the two women, born not of forgiveness exactly, but of Celine's grudging acknowledgement that Mara had not weakened Cain the way she once feared, but had instead made him steadier, more grounded than the pack had seen him in years. It was Celine, in fact, who first suggested that Mara be formally welcomed into the pack's spring gathering, a tradition Mara had not even known existed until Cain explained it to her one quiet evening by the fire. "It's an old custom," Cain said. His arms settled comfortably around her shoulders as they sat together outside the cottage, the last light of evening fading gently over the hills. Once a year, the bloodlines gather to renew old bonds and welcome new ones into the territory. It hasn't included an outsider in longer than anyone can remember. "Are you worried about how they'll react to me being there?" Mara asked. "I was," Cain admitted, until Celine of all people suggested it herself. "I think even she's begun to understand that the old fears about your kind and mine mixing were built more on habit than any real truth." The gathering took place beneath a canopy of ancient trees, deeper in the territory than Mara had ever been permitted before. Dozens of shifters from bloodlines scattered across the surrounding hills, arriving over the course of the afternoon. Some familiar faces from Hollow Pine, many others entirely new to her. She had expected to feel like an intruder among them, a fragile, temporary presence in a world built on strength and instinct far beyond her own. Instead, she found herself welcomed with a warmth she had not anticipated, curious questions about her life before Hollow Pine, quiet compliments on how steady she had remained through Celine's earlier challenge, an easy acceptance that settled something in her chest she had not realized was still tender. It was during that gathering, as the sun began setting behind the hills and the pack settled into quiet conversation around a series of low fires, that Cain pulled her gently aside, his expression carrying a nervous energy she had rarely seen from him in all the months she had known him. "There's one more custom I haven't told you about," he admitted, guiding her toward the edge of the clearing, away from the warmth and noise of the gathering. "It's not required. It's not even expected, given everything about our bond already exists outside the old rules. But I find I want it anyway, more than I've wanted almost anything." "What is it?" Mara asked, her heart beginning to quicken at the uncharacteristic uncertainty in his voice. Cain reached into his jacket and produced a small, simple ring, its band woven from a metal Mara did not recognize. dark and etched with symbols she assumed belonged to the old bloodlines he had told her so much about over the past months. Among my kind, this isn't just a symbol of intention, the way it is in your world. It's a declaration before the pack, permanent and binding, that I choose you above all other claims, above tradition, above anything the old bloodlines might still whisper about what should or shouldn't exist between us. Mara felt tears rising, warm and unexpected, as she looked between the ring and the raw sincerity in Kane's gold-flecked eyes. You already have me, Kane. You've had me since that first night at the tree line. I know, he said, his voice rough with emotion, but I want the pack to witness it. I want there to be no question left, ever, about where you belong, or who you belong to, chosen freely and completely. She said yes before he even finished the question fully formed, and the pack's reaction, when Kane led her back into the firelight with the ring settled on her hand, was unlike anything Mara could have imagined weeks before. A low, rolling sound rising from dozens of throats at once, not quite a howl, something closer to a collective, ancient sound of acknowledgement and celebration, the forest itself seeming to hum with it. Later that night, walking back toward their cottage beneath a sky thick with stars, Mara found herself thinking not of the kitchen, where her old life had ended, nor of the frightened woman who had driven blindly into the night with nowhere to go, but of the quiet, powerful truth that sometimes the very worst nights carried the seeds of the very best mornings, if only a person was brave enough to keep driving forward, instead of turning back toward what had already been lost. You're quiet, Kane observed, glancing down at her as they walked, his hand warm and steady around hers. I'm just thinking about how strange it is, Mara admitted. 3 years with Daniel, and I never once felt as certain about anything as I feel right now, after less than a year with you.
Maybe certainty was never really about time, Kane said thoughtfully. Maybe it was always about finally being with someone who saw you clearly enough to know exactly what he had.
Mara smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder as they continued walking beneath the stars, the ancient forest settling into peaceful silence around them, the storms and challenges of the past months, finally, fully behind them. Ahead, their small stone cottage waited at the edge of the clearing, its windows warm with lamplight, a home built not on convenient silence or quiet neglect, but on a bond neither of them had asked for, and both of them had ultimately chosen, again and again, with open eyes and unguarded hearts. The monster the town once whispered about in careful, fearful tones had turned out to be the gentlest, fiercest protector Mara had ever known, and the woman once left behind in a doorway, listening to someone else's laughter fill her own home, had become someone entirely new in these ancient woods, someone chosen, someone claimed, someone finally, completely home.